Welcome back to another episode of Between the Bright Lines, a podcast produced here at Rogers & Brown. My name's Berkeley, and today I'm joined by Gabe McGann.
Hey, Berkeley.
Hey, so we've had a little bit of gaps with some summer activities, and today we're going to get back and cover several things, starting with something pretty big that's happened recently, the Section 301 tariffs. Can you give us a little update on that?
Absolutely. These kind of got announced several months ago, and a lot of people speculated that they would replace the Section 122 tariffs that had an expiration date of July 24th. And sure enough, the government squeaked it right in on the night before to provide us with a bunch of different new tariff numbers to use, provisional tariff numbers, that is, covering all the different countries. It's about 60 countries, maybe exactly 60, if my math is correct. And these tariffs range from 10% to 12.5%. And again, as soon as Section 122 was expired, these went into play with an exception of a very small window where you could have a sailing date and an arrival that matched, like a 3-day window, and you might have been lucky enough to avoid some tariffs in that case. But otherwise, it wasn't a huge change because some, like I said, were 10%. Which matched the Section 122 tariffs, and these were not applicable to if 232 was applicable. So it was country specific. There were some provisions in there that allowed some products to be exempted, similar to the annexes on the IEEPAs and the 122s, but several actually got a little bit more specific within an HTS number to where it had to meet product specific categories. So not everything under an HTS was actually given preferential treatment in some cases.
Yeah, that came into effect on a Friday, which was great timing.
Yeah, we always like that, and got the pleasure of team working through the weekend to make sure everything was done in the proper fashion. And we did do a good job. I was proud of the team because they were able to get a lot of customers' freight that did meet that window free of tariffs. So hopefully they appreciate that as well.
Definitely. Entry's been very busy at work. Another Section 301 is this 25% on Brazil. Can you let us know a little bit about that?
Yeah, that one is very similar to the IEEPA specific Brazil tariff that came into play. It's mainly a 301 tariff against them. Also, it's free of the 232 from my understanding. So not exactly like the previous 301s we've seen with China that have been in place since 2018, 2019, where those were stacking on top of other tariffs, but very specific to certain products from Brazil. There were plenty of exemptions in that as well. So, unfortunately, I think, some clients did get hit with a bigger tariff, but I think in a lot of cases, the main products we actually need from Brazil were exempted. So it's just yet another 301s are always country specific. So in this case, they were really targeting Brazil as they did before with the IEEPAs, as I just mentioned. And, China was the first 301, and then the country specific, the 60 with the 301 that came out later in July, all country specific. So these give a little bit more legal grounds for the administration to try and avoid these legal kind of challenges that have taken place with both IEEPA and 122, which is 122 is still going through the court system. And obviously we've been talking about the IEEPA refunds for some time now.
And as we know, there are additional Section 301 investigations remaining. So do you expect more tariff actions to be announced soon?
Yeah, yeah. I will continue to expect new tariffs to be announced soon. I would be lying to you if I knew the specifics on a lot of these investigations, but I think you're going to continue to see these to be country specific, on countries that are not playing ball with the current administration. You can pretty much, set your clock to that. Anybody who is not on the good list is getting investigated for something. In a lot of cases, though, what happens is the products that we do need that fell on these previous annexes, they tend to be exempted. In a lot of cases too, if the country comes around to some type of negotiation, these things usually kind of fall quiet after that. But interestingly, I think you're starting to see a lot of the shape that the trade agreements took last fall as those were being agreed upon, country specific. outside of like the EU made a kind of a more group decision there, but you're getting to see a lot more of the framework and these total percentages very much mimic what we saw in those trade agreements.
And just a reminder, what do you want companies to be focusing on then?
I mean, the hard part is just to keep up with the news, but that's really what you need to do. I mean, we try to obviously get our trade alerts out as soon as we have any kind of news, even if it's something that's going to be happening in the future or something that's going to be happening more quickly than that. Um, it's a lot of the 301 has to be investigated, so you're going to get that news ahead of time. It's important for clients too because they're able to offer opinions and issue opinions or suggestions or why they feel like some products should be exempted. For example, if you can't source a product from another area of the world, I always think of some of our clients in the kind of the rubber business with a natural rubber. I think that's one of the easier things. We do not grow that in the United States, therefore you need to be able to import that. So I think clients need to be very, very upfront on the overall tariff landscape, but then very specific to what they do and where they're buying from, where their supply chains are coming from, paying close attention. And then, if there are investigations that are going to affect a company in a negative fashion, they need to be, take the opportunities given to them when these investigations are going on.
That's some great advice. And then to move forward, another interesting update in our trade landscape is that the DHS announced the largest expansion of the UFLPA Entity List.
Absolutely. If people might have missed that one too. I mean, that was something that kind of slid under the radar, but an additional, what was it? Additional 43, was it? Or something in that realm, 40 some additional entities were added to the list to up that list to 187 total. So I mean, that was a very big percentage-wise increase. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation here, but the UFLPA is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and that really started with a very specific region of China where suspected forced labor was occurring. Probably not even just suspected, forced labor was occurring. And it affected a lot of industries, specifically a lot of textile industries early on. But this list continuing to expand is a major change and something that our clients need to understand because the list has names that they may not just recognize off the cuff as part of their supply chain. You have to go back to the origins of every material, every, raw element of a product that's being imported into the United States. And if one of these companies or one of these, list on the entities that are on this list happen to be thought to be by customs or factually are part of your supply chain, you will not be able to import that product, and you could potentially lose your privileges to import if you continue to force the matter. Um, a lot of companies have had to spend a great amount of resources and time, including sending people over to China for months on end to document their entire supply chain to prove to customs that they in fact were not purchasing from any of these entities that are on the list. So adding, whatever that number was, I don't have the number in front of me, but I believe it was 40 some odd additional entities is 43. Okay, good. I was on it. So, that percentage it was well over, 25% increase from the previous list. So that is something to continue to keep an eye on because they probably won't stop there. That is something they're going to continue to investigate. They're going to continue to find these people who they're suspecting are participating in forced labor, type, practically a modern day slave labor type enterprise to produce these materials at very, very low costs.
And what would you recommend to a company that hasn't mapped out its supply chain?
Well, it's tough, but specifically if you feel like you are anywhere close to this region, from your supply chain, I would be doing everything possible to document it. And it goes down to I've heard companies documenting like time cards. I mean, literally having records of all the time cards from all the people in their supply chain from every all the way down. Some, it might be easier than others. Others are very intricate, and there's a lot of steps that go into this, and they're dealing with somebody at the very back end. They're buying something more of a finished good material. Those are the people they start with. I want to know who the people are that are involved in their supply chain, and then they might have to go to another level and another level. I mean, it could get to the point too where, like I said, if customs asks, you got to prove them wrong. Basically, you are proving your innocence. It's not you're innocent until proven guilty in these situations. You have to be able to document this, show documentation. So some people are unfortunately having to enlist consultants, trade attorneys in some cases to help get back to this, raw level of their supply chain to make sure that no entity on this list is part of it.
That's great. And then if we're switching back over to tariffs, we recently heard about the 338 tariffs that are going to be placed on Canada. So just to start with the basics, what is Section 338 and why is this particular action significant?
Well, I'm just going to read it right off the cuff here. It's Section 338 empowers the U.S. president to impose additional duties on imports from a foreign country when that country discriminates against U.S. commerce or imposes unreasonable charges, regulations, or limitations not applied equally to other countries. So I don't know what Canada did to piss us off this time, but they surely is something, and it seems like they're squarely in the crosshairs yet again for this. What do we say? Effective on August 19th. It looks like.
Yep, and an additional 50% is definitely not small.
No, and we're only a week away, or maybe a little over a week away from that. But to me, these are one of the ones you should keep an eye on for some sort of resolution to be maybe come out, and maybe you're right up at, on the deadline there. But this one seems a little surprising to me. I mean, we're looking at motor vehicles and automotive parts, alcoholic beverages, and dairy products. So Molson Canadian drinkers out there, you better buy it quick.
And something interesting too in the proclamation, it was talking about how the USMCA treatment was going to act and how it didn't necessarily mean that a product was going to be exempt, which is something we haven't necessarily seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not exactly sure how that doesn't exempt it, seeing as that's a, agreement. Now I know that some people, or, maybe our president currently isn't totally in agreement with the USMCA, even though he was part of the creation of that in the first administration. I don't really understand how the USMCA could not be valid with products. I mean, that's very specific, verbiage in there. So I would guess that there are some challenges that could be made if this were to actually go into effect and they were to not apply USMCA. To me, that seems like something that can be challenged because there wasn't a real reason given, as you and I discussed earlier, as to why or what Canada is doing that it is allowing the 338 to be imposed. Seems like there should be a little bit more specifics as to what the real issue is there, and but hopefully, in this case, this would be one that I would think that maybe could be negotiated and at least maybe put on the delay or at some sort while they work things out. Hopefully, we'll see.
Definitely. And just to reiterate what you said, is just to keep an eye out for communication, probably next week if any information comes out. And that also, if you're importing from Canada, just to review your classifications, origin, tariff treatment, etc. And then moving on to CAPE and IEEPA tariff refunds. Can you give the listeners a quick refresher on what CAPE is and where the refund process is today?
Yeah, absolutely. So CAPE is the programmed system within the ACE portal, which is allowing our importers who had IEEPA tariffs issued from February of last year, February 25 through February of this year, when then they were finally ruled unconstitutional. And it gives the importers a way to recoup their IEEPA tariffs paid plus interest. And so far, there's been a lot of success with the system. We are currently, we've had the original phase, which basically made everything that was within 80 days, with the exceptions of reconciliation early on, with the exceptions of anti-dumping and things like that. A lot of these kind of a little more intricate entries were not eligible at first, but the majority, vast majority that were at least within the 80 days of liquidation date, um, or unliquidated, of course, were eligible to recover. And there was a lot of money recovered. A number came out last week, but I believe we're in the billions and what's been returned easily. So it's, a lot of money's going back out. Reconciliation entries were then added in phase two, which I believe started in June, late June, if my memory serves. And right now, kind of where we are is, I think a lot of people have gotten a lot of the money back, but even some of the most, earliest filers in the CAPE system still had some entries that were either, liquidated due to a PSC being run, and they liquidated really quickly for whatever reason, which is to me a little bit of an issue. If things are being challenged, they probably shouldn't have been liquidating, but they were. And then, most people had at least a few of those, if not a lot, and that adds up to a decent amount of money. So the next question is okay, when is all of this when are all these entries that are past the 80 days of liquidation, or even past 180 days, which is basically final, and there is, typically there is no recourse for that. The protest period is passed. Um, a lot of unknowns with that, but some clarity is starting to pop up. I mean, a lot of people have filed protests. We have filed protests for people who have asked us to. We have filed protests for those that we could. Some were well past that period, even before we had any idea what was going on, because they liquidated so quickly, as I said. But those that were able, we have seen a lot of protest, and people are wondering if, okay, the next phase is just going to allow anything that was paused or within the 180 days. And I don't know that that's going to be the case. And I'm not sure that every importer is going to just be given that right. Even though there is definitely probably a legal argument to be made they should. It really is sounding from the verbiage that has come out of the Court of International Trade that at least those importers that were part of the cases. So you could join these cases that were the first cases to challenge IEEPA. You can still join those cases with the help of a trade attorney, filing suit against those cases in the CIT. Those importers look a lot more certain to receive the refunds on all of their remaining open entries that had IEEPA versus just somebody who has done nothing or maybe even filed a protest to stop the clock. There is quite a bit of uncertainty. And I'll have to admit, as much as I might disagree with it, my tone has started to change a little bit. And again, my opinion is only my opinion, but I certainly have suggested, to anybody with a decent amount of money. I've heard anywhere from $2,500 to maybe $5,000 to join these cases. I don't know the exact numbers. I'm not part of the conversations with the trade attorneys. That's not my business. But, I would say anybody that had more than, definitely more than $5,000 left on the table should seriously be considering, hiring an attorney to at least explore that possibility of joining the case, what it would cost. Because that's going to give you a much greater chance, if not a guarantee, of getting that money back in the long run.
That's some good information. So we're up to phase 3, and now I guess we're just waiting to see for those next phases, if there are any, and what will go from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wait and see game right now. The most recent update was really just an update that was talking about how much money has been given back and all that kind of stuff. So there wasn't much substance to the next steps, the next phases, unfortunately.
Okay, and then moving on to our freight market update, how would you describe today's freight market?
Chaotic. We have had a prolonged peak season, much longer than expected, in my opinion. I mean, I read a lot of articles. I speak with our folks overseas, some of our partners we work with from an MVOCC level, and a lot of people were predicting that this would be done and gone by now, and rates definitely softening, which we did see a soften period in the middle of July. A typhoon and then another typhoon recently, I think have really kind of thrown some chaos into that. There's a lot of blank sailings, specifically in the Shanghai region, on the Trans-Pacific lane, which is creating yet more and more of a backlog. So there was a bigger increase than really in a lot of cases leading up to August 1st, we weren't expecting an increase, but then it became pretty clear that there was. West Coast rates, not quite as high of an increase as the East Coast rates. East Coast rates definitely continued to be at a premium with, I think, a lack of space is, lack of volume in the trade lanes tends to be the reasoning for that. But even with a lot of space added back during that peak season, I mean, we are still seeing rates being increased. I'm not exactly sure about this coming weekend, the 15th, but some small, at least, increase would be expected, in my opinion. And again, like I said, we're looking at several blank sailings coming through in the China ports, the Asia ports, in late August, early September, which is going to only push that harder. So um, the freight market is chaotic. If you look at, kind of some of the India, I mean, we're back to, possible Red Sea situations. Therefore, the cargo is going back around the Cape. There's a lot of container volume issues, lack of container equipment in the India market and the biggest markets in the world, right? India, the China, Southeast Asia, a lot of container, equipment issues they're also pushing the rates back up, or at least allowing them to stay very stable. So as I've kind of said, I mean, the carriers have gotten a lot smarter. They're taking vessels out, they're adding vessels much more strategically than they ever did in the past, really ever since COVID, post COVID, and that chaos has really, given the carriers a lot more information. There's a lot more data out there to be had. It's so when these situations occur, the rates go pretty significantly up, and I would say, we're close to triple where we were late April, early May right now. So no real expectation for that to start decreasing likely until probably the back end of September, I would think.
And which trade lanes should our importers be monitoring most close?
I mean, definitely Trans-Pacific. Trans-Pacific, eastbound from Southeast Asia, to the United States, either through the canal or into the West Coast ports. And then, of course, India to the US. Those are just the major lanes right now. I mean, there's obviously plenty of volume in other lanes, Europe to the US, South America to the US, but, a big growing sector there. But, the main ones, the main players are the ones that are taking the biggest kind of rate increases.
I gotcha. So we'll see how this works itself out throughout the remainder of the month and the year. So looking ahead, what should our listeners be focusing on?
Well, I mean, tariff news, of course. I don't think most importers didn't take much of a change with this whole 301. Obviously, like you said, the Brazil was a hit for those importers from Brazil, that their commodities did fall on the 301 list. However, they were not, applied if 232 was applicable. Same thing with the other 60 301 countries, they got hit. So I don't think there was a lot of change there. In some cases, maybe 2.5% at most difference. So not the biggest fluctuations that like we've seen over the past year. 301s, in my opinion, probably have the best chance of settling and sticking around, which hopefully adds to some stability in the tariff game. But we keep seeing these, like the Canada 338. I mean, we just keep seeing these things pop up, the 301 investigations that are ongoing. And just because there's an investigation doesn't mean it necessarily is going to happen. I think that you don't typically hear about it unless there's some kind of, where there's smoke, there's fire type thing. But you just got to keep, the nose to the grindstone, listening to the news, just trying to plan ahead to the best of your ability. I think the freight should stabilize a little bit more as we get into the back end of this year. I think we really are starting to see a little bit of a pattern when it comes to the peak season starting earlier. A lot of people feel that that might be tariff driven, and I think there is something to that, but we have multiple years in a row now where the peak season has started in May, more or less. That used to not happen. Peak season traditionally was maybe the end of June, typically July, definitely August through the back end of September, and then the air freight kind of bleeding into October. Very much related to our holiday season. Not as much anymore. This is not that. And, we had kind of seen that traditional peak season go away, and this has replaced it. Last year, it was a much tighter window, but the rates did increase very similarly. So I think we're starting to lean into that. Not surprisingly, that this is kind of happening at the beginning of a negotiation season. So when Trans-Pacific rates in a lot of cases go into place on May 1st every year, so there could be something to that as well, where clients are negotiating their rates and then starting to heavily ship on the front end of those contracts and pushing the market into a little bit of a frenzy. So that's about all you can really do. Again, obviously understanding your supply chain. We talked about the UFLPA. That, that's a big deal, but that's not a big deal for every importer. This is a small percentage of importers that would have, kind of ties to this region. So those people should be very knowledgeable about that and then really paying close attention to all these companies that get at it. Because if they're doing their due diligence, they would know very quickly if that name pops up on any of their lists.
Definitely, and just something that we reiterate, I feel like every episode is just to stay proactive with your compliance, sourcing, freight planning. Just make sure that you're prepared for these changes and updates. But is there anything else that you'd like to add to today's episode?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just touched on that compliance aspect. You're absolutely right, and I think a lot of people took for granted what being an importer into the United States meant. Um, in my sales life, that was in a lot of cases a difficult conversation. That wasn't the forefront of a lot of importers thinking. Now, of course, the bigger importers, bigger companies, anybody that's had any kind of customs auditing or anything like that is already very aware of that. But I think if you aren't dedicated to your compliance as a everyday importer into the United States right now, you're making a mistake. That's not to say you can't correct that mistake and really get involved, but I don't think that there's any excuse for pleading ignorance anymore with all of this. There's a lot of information available. We're on this is industry is on the nightly news practically daily at this point, which was never the case before. We have some compliance updates coming into we're expecting some much more strict kind of regulations for importers, specifically foreign importers. I think you're going to see a lot of foreign importers' ability to be an importer of record go away in the next 6 months, because they're not going to be able to meet the expectations. What now? We're waiting for those to be rolled out, but there's some that will say that you have to have some sort of presence in the United States. There's going to be a bigger bonding requirement, maybe even some tie to a U.S. bank. There's a lot of kind of speculation out there, and they're still going through a lot of this, but U.S. importers aren't going to be free of scrutiny either. They're going to be much more heavily scrutinized, and I think that customs has AI tools in place. We're already seeing this. The enforcement is for real. If you haven't experienced that yet, it probably won't take long. There is a lot of information, a lot of scrutiny, a lot of data that customs is able to now crunch using these AI tools, and they're going for the low hanging fruit. I mean, you're out there classifying things incorrectly, and I don't understand that because I don't understand how a broker would allow that personally. But I think that there are some bad actors out there that are probably going to find themselves in hot water in the customs brokerage world as well.
And I like what you said earlier. Ignorance is definitely not an excuse, not in this administration or trade representatives, any of it. They're over it. So that'll be interesting to see how this year plays out in the next year to follow. But thank you, Gabe, for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us for another episode of Between the Freight Lines. If you found today's discussion helpful, make sure to subscribe and follow Rogers and Brown. We'll send out the recent trade alerts and podcast episodes so you can stay up to date. Looking forward to talking to y'all next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Between the Freight Lines, a podcast produced here at Rogers and Brown. If you have any feedback or recommendations for future episodes, please feel free to reach out. Thank you. We'll talk to y'all next time.
This podcast is for general information only and is not legal advice.